All right, welcome everyone to possibly the final Pod Security Policy breakout session on March 24th.
It's a great feeling.
All right, can you all see my Chrome tab?
Yes.
Yep.
Would someone volunteer to take notes or either in the sig-auth agenda or just as comments on the CAP as we talk through?
I'm in the CAP. I'm happy to write things up there. If there are more freeform things, if someone wants to also jot them down in the agenda, that might be useful to capture flow of conversation, but I don't know.
Any volunteers for additional notes?
Hey, this is Pushkar. I'm new to the sig-auth agenda template, but I'm happy to take notes if somebody can point me where. I have the doc open on my side.
Thank you. I'll drop a link in the chat. We may need to join sig-auth, the Google group, in order to have editor access on that. That was the view one. That should work.
Yeah, okay. I just tried typing something. I am in suggesting mode. I don't know if that works.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, all right, cool.
Okay, where are we? All right. I think we can debate what color to paint this bike shed later on in the meeting, if there's time for it. So I'm just going to, actually, before I jump through the unresolved sections, is there any kind of big overarching feedback, comments, concerns, questions on the overall proposal? Or should we just go through the details?
Clayton left a comment that I don't understand. It was sort of around, it was more around the CRD stuff, so maybe that's more detailed. We can get to that. But
it's pretty detailed. I have a similar concern.
Okay. I thought there was another one who was talking about conformance. Thinking through conformance, I'm not sure this meets the default bar today. And I didn't really understand if that was like an objection to the enabled by default, or...
I think it's a concern about whether a conformance test would require this admission plugin to be present and require certain pieces of configuration for it. You can imagine things like default enforcement level. You probably wouldn't want to make that a conformance thing. Requiring it to be on maybe is even a little strong.
I wouldn't want to require it to be on or enforcing anything for conformance, because if it's Kubernetes, that means that running a pod gives you root on every node. Like, in some sense, the whole purpose of this is to intentionally and surgically break conformance, as is the case with any admission controller.
Yeah, I agree.
Comment about the E2E test, which I didn't read as saying like this was going to be required for conformance, or it was just saying like how are we going to test this feature? So I tended to agree that like able to be on by default is a good goal. If you don't have an opinion, having it on by default I think is a good thing, but I would be fine with someone running a cluster deciding in their environment it should be off. But we're just giving them tools so that it can be on by default reasonably.
Yeah, Dimps also had a question around conformance. And I think a reasonable goal is that you should be able to pass conformance with this on. and maybe even with this defaulting new namespaces to baseline or possibly even restricted. And that might require adding policy level labels to the E2E namespaces as part of the conformance tests. I think I captured that in a possible extension. Yeah, so it's the...
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be possible to do. It's just something to note. Don't want to.
Yep.
Don't want to end up broken there.
Yep. All right. Let's see. Okay, this has to do with naming, so I'm gonna skip that for now. This is also more to do with language, but I think it's worth having this discussion. I like that allow means what it says. So if I say I would like to allow baseline policy, really what I mean is I'm going to deny anything above that, but it's sort of allow baseline is I think a way that a lot of people will think about that. The problem is that the audit and warn labels don't quite line up with that semantically. So if I say audit baseline, what I actually mean is record an audit annotation for pods that exceed the baseline value. Similarly with warn. So one option we had discussed was something like audit above or warn above, but those are sort of cumbersome, especially when you have audit above version thrown in there.
I'm a big fan of the enforce. It is a little more ambiguous, but I don't think it's necessarily that ambiguous if you were thinking of it as an admission controller, because an admission controller enforcing its will on you means rejecting you when it doesn't like you. So like, I think that the extra context helps it to not be as ambiguous as it could be.
Even
like,
that though is
at this level.
That still has the same issue that Tim said. So if you enforce baseline, then that's the level that that enforcement is holding. If you warn baseline, if you
that's still
submit
the
a
level
pod
it's
that meets
holding.
baseline, you won't actually get warned about it. So I agree that they're confusing. I had a really hard time thinking of better names. If people have better names for audit and warn, I'd be super happy to hear them.
I guess I'll say I didn't have that much issue with allow or enforce and audit and warn, but I really didn't like deny. I had difficulty, like in my head, reasoning about what I would put in deny.
Yeah, I think enforce is better than deny. I would be happy to continue treating audit and warn as placeholders, and then have a big naming yak shaving party where we just brainstorm names for like 8 hours. I'm kidding. I wouldn't be happy about that, but
we'll put that as the first item on the next sig-auth meeting, right?
The next 6. Okay. Well, I just wanted to kind of call out that piece. Oh, sorry. Is someone else trying to? I think we can kind of take this discussion offline. If you think of any ideas, then by all means, please drop them in there. Otherwise, let's move on. All right, so versioning, there's some nuance that needs to be worked out around versioning.
Did you skip over validation?
I did. Did you have a concern around validation?
I do. I am trying to work out how important we consider the validation to be, given that admission plugins are optional, so we wouldn't actually be able to be sure the data was right. Like, is this just a be nice to the user and suggest for them, or do we consider this important for data integrity?
I had two comments about that. I like keeping it gathered in the admission plugin so that if you don't want this active in your cluster, you can actually like completely isolate it, disable it. If it's also in the same bucket of code as the admission stuff, I'm envisioning that being in a location that's referenceable by things outside Kubernetes. So that would make that same logic usable externally, maybe against an older cluster as a webhook or some custom policy. As far as data integrity, because this is being added to Kubernetes 120 whatever, like we already have to define how this behaves if there are labels we consider malformed with these keys. So I think we already have to define that no matter what we do, whether we put validation code in the namespace validation path or an admission.
Then I think we should call out I don't have an issue with that, but I think we should call out very clearly that this validation is best effort and in no way protects the actual data that we have. I do think there are ways to tighten that if we really wanted to. I don't look at them and see them as being worthwhile. So.
Or
yeah, we scrolled off the API section. We touched on this last time, but I didn't see any call out here describing the decision to use labels as the main API versus creating a new resource. And I think that feels a little bit novel to me, and at least I'd like us to kind of make sure that everybody's considered the trade-offs and that we're happy with them.
Plus one that I think labels are much better than creating a new resource. I say this as one of the primary people who used to be advocating for creating a new resource, but like calling out specifically, this is why we think it's better than creating a new resource. Like if it only takes a couple of sentences, could help people to understand it better when they're reading it.
yeah, I'm happy to add that. Just briefly going back to admission, I see this as, the validation. I see this as more guardrails to protect users against accidentally having a typo that causes what they think is enforcing to be ignored.
Super fun from a persistence perspective too, like just intentionally misspell like enforce, like or intentionally misspell something, so then somebody looks at it and sees it and thinks that they're protected.
Yeah, especially when the default is privileged. I can add that into the validation section as well.
Yeah, I guess I would also mention when you do that like when you turn this on, it doesn't actually do that for clusters, and it doesn't do that if you ever turn this off. And that's fine, but just making people aware.
Yeah.
The typo in a label is another reason I really don't want unwieldy label keys like warn dot above or warn dash above or warn if exceeds level. Like the weirder and longer and more hyphenated dot delimited we make these label keys, the more likely they will be typoed.
Yeah, the prefix is already getting pretty long.
And the schema isn't really defined anywhere concrete.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to chat about the label versus distinct object here, or just take that offline and kind of circle back if there are still questions?
I'm happy to discuss it here. I briefly was considering whether we should consider adding fields to the namespace itself. The nice thing that the labels get you is the ability to make queries like show me all of the namespaces that are not pinned to the latest version, or show me namespaces that don't have a policy set on them. I think you demoed both of those, Jordan.
Labels also get you versus objects. If you only have, fairly small enumeration of these things, and you're not going to allow any customization, you would end up having very few API objects, relatively, right? Either that, or you would end up placing an API object inside of a namespace that would present some sort of read challenges. Not an impossibility, but you would have to dig down and then find the parent namespace, sort of thing.
The ability to do things atomically was also, so being able to do things atomically and having a singleton per namespace, those were the two reasons that I liked having it be on the namespace object. So we had talked about like having a single policy level applying to a namespace for a given action. And if you had a separate object, you would either have to make it a singleton, like say the name of the object must be default or something, or you open the door to having like multiple competing objects applying, or or you have multiple competing objects applying, which actually makes the dry run scenarios really hard to reason about. Like you're not sure which warn level policy or enforce level policy is effective. The atomic thing, this lets you create a namespace and define the policy level for it in a single shot, instead of like create a namespace and then create an object inside the namespace, and in the window in between, hope that no pods get created inside it.
Don't you still have a race until the admission controller observes what the labels are on the namespace?
Not the admission controller only allows pods that it can find the namespace for. So the way my proof of concept was written up, when a pod comes in, it looks for the namespace in its informer, and if it can't find it, it does a live get of the namespace. So it will never allow in a pod that it hasn't explicitly gotten the namespace for. Now, if you change the level later, there's certainly a race condition there, right? Like if I have a namespace and something's creating pods and I'm like, I'm gonna lock this down, like, yeah, there's a race there, but there was already a race there.
Yeah, that's inevitable.
Okay, makes sense.
I do like the labels versus adding fields to the namespace, just because it makes it more clear, I think, that this admission controller is not part and parcel of the core Kubernetes experience. Like those additional fields would be really weird in clusters where you turned this off because you were using Gatekeeper.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, can we talk about versioning? So this first question is around what do we do if the so in the webhook implementation, this wouldn't be an issue with the built-in one, but if you're running, like say you decide that we ship this in 122 and you'd really like to run it on your 119 cluster, so you run it as a webhook. Or in the future, maybe there's a new policy that comes out in Kubernetes 128, and you'd really like to get that policy level on your, or those policy changes on your 126 cluster. So you can run it as a webhook to kind of backport that, essentially. But if we do that, how do we want to handle the case where your cluster is running 126 and you're asking for the 128 policy? Again, in the built-in version, we would just consider that as latest. That's required to handle version skew and backports, or rollbacks. But in the webhook case, we could say that if you ask for the 128 profile and the webhook knows what the 128 profile is, then it can actually enforce that. There's one caveat that suppose the 128, suppose in 128 we add some new field that adds on some additional restrictions on a pod, and we decide this is best practice and you should enable it in the restricted profile. Now the 128 restricted profile might require you to set a field that doesn't exist in the 126 API version. So it would be impossible to meet those requirements.
I think that's what's printed on the tin.
Yeah.
Like, you asked for it, you did the work of extracting the code out and running it as a webhook. Like, yeah. I think if you're that sophisticated, you understand that.
Well, I guess I don't have an example that would immediately bite us, but I can see someone not expecting the latest behavior to choose the latest available for the webhook and not the latest with respect to the cluster. I can imagine someone being surprised by that. I also don't think we require /version to actually return the Q version in terms of conformance. So I don't know how you would discover what version a cluster is at.
Do we not?
I didn't think so, because for a while in OpenShift, we had an accident where we returned the version as version 3.
That's just because you love version endpoints, David. That's why you have so many of them. Yeah, I mean, like my first thought would be when you're running it as a webhook, you get to tell the webhook what does latest mean. Like I'm running my webhook on a whatever server, so latest means 117, even though I built you with the library that understands like maybe.
One, can you share a webhook across multiple clusters, across multiple versions?
Sure.
Sure. Then you can't necessarily resolve unless you can identify on the incoming request what latest means at that point, right? You must a priori know static. Obviously, we would make the version into the path of the webhook. No, it just gets squirrelier and squirrelier. Yeah, so but the thing that I don't like about making a webhook enforce the version is because it's surprising as a normal person, because the policy is written in namespaces on the cluster. It's not like, yes, I understand the webhook is the enforcement mechanism, but I edit my cluster and namespaces on site cluster to cause changes in behavior. Like, I don't know. I can't imagine myself wanting the 118 policy on a 117 cluster, because I don't know what that means, because I don't have a time machine that lets me go in the future, or I guess technically I'm going in the past in this mode, but I definitely can't go in the future. Well, the point is that if you don't specify a version, like, you're going to get whatever the webhook thinks the latest means, which depends on what version of this policy it was built against. Are the concerns around this specific to the, like, a webhookified version of this?
Or
yeah, that was the only one you couldn't get a version for. But actually thinking about it, once it's built in, why would anyone install the webhook?
I kind of agree. I mean, I guess
because you're not allowed to alter the API server flags on your hosted Kubernetes version. Theoretically speaking.
So if you were on a hosted version that chose not to enable this even once it was built in, that's one possibility. Another possibility is a custom policy that is linking against this component and then layering on some stuff of its own. So they want like mostly this behavior, but with a tweak. And so.
And they're willing to fork for it. Yeah.
Or build on top of it. I mean, I don't think they'd even need to fork it. Like you can, like the
just vendor it in.
The runtime class thing is a good example. Like if baseline is effectively restricted with a given runtime class, then like I could use this and say, oh, I'm going to apply the baseline policy when I see restricted plus runtime class foo.
To answer Mo's question also, why you might want to run a 118 policy on a 117 cluster, we might, I can think of two possibilities. One would be we decide that something that we didn't used to consider best practice is now best practice. So we make the restricted policy more restricted. Another one is, this actually came up when we were debating whether to allow patch versions in the version information, is I could imagine having a CVE come out that exploits a field that wasn't previously restricted. And we decide, okay, we weren't thinking about this in the past, but this field should really be restricted because it can lead to this exploit. And so we add that in. And we would just add that into the next version. And you might want to backport that as a CVE fix.
But wouldn't the backported CVE fix apply to the old version and thus using the old version of the policy, but with a newer version of the webhooks?
No, because we wouldn't be able to backport if it was a breaking change, like an additional restriction. We wouldn't be able to backport that to, say, the 117 profile. We'd have to add it into the 118 profile.
Is there any value in supporting more than? I guess not. What I was thinking about then is, if you're in a situation where you can't easily upgrade your cluster, I guess the webhook would be your way out.
Yeah.
Just using
There's another concern around kind of version skew with the webhook, which is if I forget to upgrade my webhook, and no one's really looking at it. Webhook's at 116, the cluster's now at 123, and I think I'm getting the latest version of the policy on 123, but it turns out that there's a bunch that's not enforced. We could just say that's part of the operational burden, is you're on the hook to keep this thing up to date.
I mean, you could also say that someone wants to add a field to the admission review, like say this is the version of my kube server. That would seem to be unambiguous. Is it useful for anything besides this? I'm not aware of anyone requesting it, but I'm not viscerally against it.
Okay, I think we should move on.
I'm trying to capture some of this in the discussion just to like remember what we talked about.
Yeah, thank you. Did you have a question? Or can we move on? Okay. Covered that. Okay. Under an older version of a policy, new field may only be set to its default value or left unset. So let's say, so this is the case where I have my policy pinned to 122. I upgrade my cluster to 123, and we add a new field to pods. So for backwards compatibility, all the policies need to allow the unset or default value of the new field. So in other words, pods that were allowed in the previous version are still allowed without setting that field. There's two questions around this. The first is, do we want to restrict all new fields that get added to the pod with version skew, or should it only apply restrictions to fields that we think that we're going to have an opinion, the policy is going to have an opinion about? To give a concrete example, let's suppose we add a new resource field, maybe pod overhead. We can use that as an example. That's something that the policy controller is probably not going to have an opinion about. Would we say that you have to use the default value or upgrade to a newer policy version that says I don't care about this field? Yeah.
You got to completely ignore every pod field that didn't exist at the time that that policy was written, because you have no idea what that field could be. You have no idea what it could mean.
I think I agree on ignoring fields that we don't care about, but suppose that we added a new type of privileged. So maybe we decided to have a privileged enum field, right? Yeah, super privileged.
Super privileged.
Run this pod as a uncontained host process.
It's cruise control for cool, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a case where I would definitely expect that field to not be allowed under the baseline and restricted policies.
Under the versioned baseline and restricted policies for previous versions that didn't have that field?
Yeah, because it was impossible to set that field in 110. Like, you could not set super privileged true in 110. And so new fields that the policy has an opinion about can be enforced as long as they're allowed to either be unset or have their default value, I think. Like,
Not the same thing.
If the thought experiment is every pod that was allowed in that old version by that policy must continue to be allowed. I think that's the guarantee. And so then if there are new fields, we can decide, like, is this a field that we have an opinion about? Like pod overhead? No, we don't have an opinion about it. So, like, whatever, if you want to quota it, knock yourself out, but we don't care. If it's a field we have an opinion about, like super privileged or host process, if it's new, as long as like it being unset or the default value for the baseline policy is permitted, like every old client will be kept whole. Like, we're not going to start breaking an old client that was successfully creating this pod.
Are we trying to provide this guarantee assuming that we have updated our admission plugin and you're running the updated one, or are we going to try to find a way to do this without having updated that webhook? You could imagine some things like I'm given a schema. That seems quite difficult.
This is like a reason not to run an older webhook on a newer cluster, because it's built in.
It is, but I imagine people would do that by accident.
Mm-hmm.
I think this question mostly applies to the built-in version. I think we just need to say that if you're running the webhook, best practice is to upgrade the webhook before you upgrade your cluster.
Okay, just want to make sure I've understood the constraints on it, because then we can actually at least say like, yeah, we know this new field came in and we care.
It does mean that if you're not running an up-to-date webhook, the behavior of a pinned version should be slightly different. But I'm not sure that there's much we can do about that.
Talk about webhook. Are we actually talking about making a webhook, or is this in a hypothetical case where somebody makes a webhook by importing the Go packages?
So the proposal is to have an officially supported webhook implementation. So basically, we would implement the core logic as a library in a separate repo, and we would also have a a containerized webhook implementation of that you can run. And then we would also import that library into Kubernetes for the core admission controller logic. That's open for debate, but that's
do we think that's valuable enough to take on that maintenance overhead forever?
I think the maintenance overhead is fairly minimal, given that this particular one isn't one that would need to provide, it wouldn't need to identify whoever calls to it. So it would be very similar to the sample that we provide already for our EDE tests. And I can see value for cases like you mentioned where it's not there in somebody wishes to add it as a webhook and they aren't cluster admin, or they aren't able to administer the actual QAPI server.
I think the biggest maintenance burden would be building and shipping the container release every version.
Yeah, I mean, we ship sample extension API server images that we use in EDE tests that are kept up to date. This seems like it would be a similar level of difficulty. I think if we are wanting these, we had talked about the tests for these being written in a way that they could be run against this reference implementation or against another implementation. And we'd also talked about like this reference implementation being able to be used as a building block in someone's custom policy. And so both of those aspects make locating the code in a place where it can be consumed very attractive. The actual webhook server shim over that, where you decode a thing and then evaluate it against this policy, like I don't think that would be the majority of the code we'd be supporting, and that
it's not a heap of Go.
Yeah. I mean, the examples we have are like a couple files, like one for the inputs and one for the admission review decode encode cycle. But then the bulk of it is going to be the actual policy and the actual tests.
It might be a heap of boilerplate.
David, thinking back to your question about detecting, I think it'd actually be easy to detect when a server that knows about pod fields that we don't know about is sending us an admission review. I could see an option to say if we get sent pod fields we don't understand, like don't allow it.
I can see that. I don't think you'd be able to interpret default values.
You wouldn't care. There would just be a field on a pod that you didn't like, and you'd tell it to go pound sand.
I could see rejecting that, but then it would be inconsistent with the behavior of the built-in admission plugin.
I imagine you'd do it like as a command line option on your webhook that you would have to turn on if you wanted to be like super weird, strict I'm running something in an anachronistic way mode.
I wouldn't go as far as super weird. Like we've had cases in the past, right? We've had init containers. They came in. We're looking at adding the debug ephemeral containers, right? There was a discussion of attempting to do post hooks. There's a discussion of additional fields for Windows, right? I see cases where we are talking about adding fields that matter. I can see a reason to allow fields with default values. Many of those defaults will be filled in, right? API defaulting fills them in before you call this webhook.
Right. So what I'm saying is, like, if we want to ensure that the webhook is updated prior to the server, so that it understands all the fields the server does, then the presence of those defaulted fields means that the server is newer than we are. And so you could tell the webhook, reject pods sent to you by a server that have fields that you don't understand. You could. I don't know if we want to, but.
Right, but we could not say allow default values for fields
Right.
I don't understand because I don't know the default value. Right.
I'm just trying to think of ways to help people avoid foot guns and help and try to decide which foot gun is worse. Like, forget to upgrade your webhook first and then not be able to create pods, or forget to upgrade your webhook first and then be able to create super privileged pods.
Yeah.
I think we shouldn't optimize too much for the webhook case. I think that there's value in it, in shipping it, but in terms of kind of making the really streamlined, nuanced process, I think we should focus on the built-in one. For time's sake, I'm going to propose we move on. There was one other open question around new fields. Should we restrict it to only the default/unset value, or do we want to go so far as to say if there are strictly more privileged options, those are allowed as well?
Less privilege?
Yeah, so allow privilege escalation as an example. Prior to what is it, like 1.7, you like a restricted, there is no concept of allow privilege escalation, so all pods have it implicitly. So the restricted policy doesn't have an opinion about it. So if you're pinned to 1.7, then come 1.8, we would say, okay, you're allowed to set the default value, which is true, on the 1.7 restricted profile level. Do we also allow you on the 1.7 restricted profile to set the non-default value of allow privilege escalation equals false?
This basically comes down to, if we conceptualize every new pod field that is relevant to the admission controller as defaulting to safe or defaulting to unsafe, then the ones where the new one defaults to unsafe, do we allow adding the safer non-default value?
Yeah. I think we can just allow it safely.
It seems good.
And I think that's the superior experience. So there could be cases where it's a little more ambiguous. And I think if there's any ambiguity, then we just deny it.
So like that would be, for an example of, if we had a release of this before runtime class was added, and then we add runtime class, where changing runtime class clearly has a security impact, but that security impact is unclear. It's like a side gray.
Yeah, that's a good example. Adding a new volume type might be another example.
So are we? maybe some of this comes down to how you were planning to determine whether a pod that you got had a field you didn't recognize that was defaulted, or whether it had a field you don't recognize that was set.
Well, that's for the webhook case.
Well, for both, right?
I mean, a field you don't recognize is easy. Like round trip it through your typed v1 pod, and if there's any diff, then there's a field you don't recognize. I don't think the webhook should get in the business of trying to figure out defaults. Like,
Yeah,
if you want to do something with the webhook, it's just like fail on unrecognized fields. Like
I was just imagining this as something we would try to write once per release and never touch it again. And so we would try to do something like clear the fields we don't know and run it through the defaulting chain a second time. And we have all the code to do that. We can just call set defaults on pod. And if you get a diff and it is not the same that came into you, you know that it was not a default value. That's what I was expecting. So we never had to touch it post-release, if that makes sense.
I was not expecting this to have access to the defaulting code. In terms of like a philosophy for new fields, I think we just talked through examples that make sense. And I think we agree, like, you should allow things that previously were allowed. So allow absence of a field. You should allow the default value, at least for the baseline case. You should allow them to opt into a more restricted version. Like all of those things make sense. I think writing up those like litmus tests to help us evaluate new fields would be really useful.
Yeah, will do. All right, I'm gonna say let's move on. I think I'll update these with what we've discussed, but there's probably still some nuances that are a little unresolved, which we can follow up on offline. I'm going to punt on this one. It's a detail we can work out offline. This should be a quick question. Should we, when a new namespace is created, I suppose this would make it a mutating controller. So there's that issue. But should we set the default policy mode labels on the namespace? So for instance, if I've configured my cluster to say no label equals baseline, if I create a new namespace, would you expect it to get the baseline label added?
I think I would expect that if instead of setting no label equals baseline, if you set new namespace equals baseline.
Yeah, I think in the interest of avoiding mutation completely, I'd like to just leave this off.
I really like clean separations between user data and non-user data when possible, and being able to look at a namespace and tell the difference between like a user or I guess an admin who is managing this namespace had an opinion about the policy for this namespace versus like it just got created like during the month when this was the default. I like not mutating it so we can tell the difference between those two.
I agree. Okay, let's call that one resolved.
That also makes it so that changing the unlabeled setting on your cluster does what you think. If you mutated it, then changing the unlabeled setting on your cluster wouldn't actually affect any policy change, and that seems weird.
Yeah, I think in the demo I showed you can find namespaces that haven't explicitly expressed a level, and like if we stomp the labels on them, we've lost data there.
Yeah,
not being able to tell the difference.
Okay, hopefully another quick one. should we default the kube system the kube system namespace to being exempt, or for kind of when we auto create it, should we automatically add the privilege label to it?
I feel like this should be punted to distributions, but I would love to hear what y'all think about the idea of punting something like this to distributions.
I like not treating cube systems specially. I think in the early days of Cube, we like really didn't treat it specially. Now there are a few concessions, like you can't delete it because it deletes the Kubernetes service, and that can be impossible to recover from. But not every cluster has to run privileged things inside Cube system. If you're not self-hosting stuff,
a lot of my clusters don't run anything in kube system.
Right. If you don't, yeah. So the fact that it's entirely possible to run a cluster that doesn't run privileged things inside kube system, to me, says we shouldn't make that a default or force that choice on the cluster operator.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay, we're coming to the time limit. I would like to talk about updates, but before we do that, do folks want to have another one of these discussions in 2 weeks, or should we take everything offline on the KEP at this point?
On that one, I'm actually curious about whether we got any good feedback from the survey you put out, and whether that's worth discussing for a future meeting.
I can think about sharing an anonymized version of that feedback. There were some comments on there. I felt like they were mostly comments that we had discussed in the past. There wasn't anything that I particularly felt the need to discuss in this meeting here. But I can look into sharing some of that.
Okay, sounds good.
I would lean towards let's schedule another one in 2 weeks with the idea of having a check-in like part way, and if things seem to be rolling along asynchronously such that the meeting doesn't seem necessary, then we cancel it. But like in the history of this project, having deadline-driven development has actually seemed to help things roll along, and so therefore I wouldn't want to give that up, like at least until the KEP is merged.
Okay, I'm happy with that. And we'll keep.
I was just going to say, this was pretty high bandwidth. I appreciate being able to bounce back and forth quickly.
Yeah, and everything we've talked about is going to go through the KEP anyway, so anyone who's not able to make the meeting will be able to follow.
Yeah, I do imagine there's going to be at least a couple more. Sorry, I do imagine there's at least a couple more points that are going to benefit from a fast back and forth conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm sad we don't get to talk about updates, but I think we should probably call it so everyone can get to their next meetings. So yeah, thank you. This was useful. We don't need to wait until the next meeting in 2 weeks to follow up on some of these unresolved issues. So if you have time before then to leave additional comments or weigh in on some of the unresolved sections or existing comment threads, please do. And I'll make an effort to update, push an update with what we talked about today. Probably won't get to that for a few days.
I want to say thank you all so much for having this thing continue to roll along. We're doing so good.
Yeah, thank you.